There is a question very few people ask because the answer is far too uncomfortable. Why can some people sit on a porch, look at the horizon, and simply exist for a few minutes without feeling guilty, while others become restless almost immediately? Why can some people take a vacation and return restored, while others come back more exhausted than when they left? Why can a free Sunday feel like freedom to one person and like a threat to another? If you have ever experienced the feeling of finally having no tasks, no obligations, no real urgencies, and still felt an almost automatic urge to find something to do, answer, organize, plan, or fix, this video may explain something important about your nervous system. Because maybe the problem was never a lack of rest. Maybe the problem is that rest has been interpreted by your organism as something dangerous. And that idea sounds absurd until you understand how the human brain learns. Most people believe the nervous system clearly distinguishes between threat and safety, but it does not work that way. The nervous system does not respond to what is true. It responds to what it has learned. That distinction changes everything. Imagine two children growing up in completely different environments. The first grows up in a relatively predictable environment. Moments of rest are genuinely moments of rest. When the family is sitting around the table, nobody is expecting a crisis. When night comes, the day is over. When there is silence, silence means peace. Over the years, that child's nervous system learns a simple association. Calm means safety. Now imagine another child. A child growing up in an environment where moments of calm rarely stay calm for very long. Maybe conflicts appear without warning. Maybe there is constant change. Maybe there is emotional instability. Maybe recognition comes only through performance. Maybe affection appears more easily when there are results. Maybe the environment is unpredictable. In that system, a different association begins to form, not consciously, physiologically. The brain begins to learn something extremely specific. When I am attentive, I am safer. When I am productive, I have more value. When I am doing something, I have more control. When I am still, something might happen. And that is how one of the quietest conditionings of adult life is born. The association between movement and safety, between productivity and protection, between constant activity and emotional survival. Decades later, the person no longer remembers the process that created that association, but they continue living inside it. That is why some people cannot enjoy a free afternoon. Not because they hate resting, but because their nervous systems never learned that resting is safe. There is a fascinating concept in neuroscience called implicit associative learning. Much of what the brain learns never reaches consciousness. The system simply observes patterns. If one condition repeatedly appears alongside another condition, the brain creates a connection. If effort was frequently followed by safety, recognition, or predictability, effort begins to mean safety. If pauses were frequently followed by anxiety, criticism, abandonment, or unpredictability, pauses begin to mean risk. This happens beneath language, beneath logic, beneath rational analysis. That is why many people intellectually know they deserve rest, but they cannot feel it. The mind says one thing, the nervous system says another. And when there is a conflict between thought and neuroception, neuroception almost always wins. Stephen Porges, creator of Polyvagal Theory, demonstrated something extraordinary. The nervous system is continuously evaluating safety and threat before consciousness even participates in the process. He called this mechanism neuroception. Neuroception does not ask, is there actually danger? It asks, does this resemble something that previously required vigilance? And that question completely changes how we understand the guilt of resting. Because for many people, a pause is not perceived as recovery. It is perceived as exposure when work stops, when tasks are finished, when there is nothing left to solve, when the phone becomes quiet, when the emails stop, when the schedule finally opens up. Something curious happens. The nervous system loses the activity that was functioning as a regulation strategy. And without that activity, a void appears. But that void is not merely the absence of occupation. It is the absence of distraction, the absence of movement, the absence of control. And that is exactly where many people begin to feel discomfort. Restlessness appears. The need to check something emerges. The urge to organize a drawer, reply to a message, plan the next week, create a new goal, start a new project. Anything that returns to the organism the familiar feeling of doing. Because doing feels safe, stopping feels vulnerable. There is a particularly interesting line of research conducted by psychologist Sandy Mann at the University of Central Lancashire. In a simple experiment, participants were asked to remain without stimulating activities for a relatively short period of time. No phone, no reading, no music, no entertainment, just being there. The results surprised the researchers. Many people reported significant discomfort. Some described restlessness, others irritation, others an almost physical sensation of needing to do something, not because they were facing a real problem, but because the system was not accustomed to the absence of stimulation. That detail matters. The modern brain is not merely accustomed to activity, it has been trained to depend on it. Over years, perhaps decades, many people have built an entire identity around productivity. Not a routine, an identity. There is an enormous difference between those two things. A routine is something you do, an identity is something you believe you are. And when productivity stops being a behavior and becomes an identity, resting stops being merely resting. It begins to threaten the very perception of personal worth. This helps explain something that seems contradictory. Many people do not feel guilty when they work excessively, even when they are exhausted, even when they are becoming ill, even when they are sacrificing important relationships. But they do feel guilty when they rest, as if the mistake were not the excess, as if the mistake were the pause, as if the organism had completely reversed the logic of recovery. Researcher Matthew Lieberman of UCLA described something that helps explain this phenomenon. The human brain places enormous importance on identity coherence. When a behavior conflicts with a constructed identity, discomfort emerges. If someone deeply believes they are a productive, efficient, always available person, a period of rest may be interpreted by the brain as inconsistency, and inconsistency creates tension. Not because there is real danger, but because there is a threat to the internal narrative. The organism attempts to restore coherence, and often does so by immediately returning to activity, returning to work, returning to tasks, returning to effort, returning to movement, which creates a cycle that is extraordinarily difficult to notice. The more a person produces, the more they reinforce an identity based on production. The more they reinforce that identity, the harder it becomes to rest. The harder it becomes to rest, the more activity is used to relieve discomfort. And the more activity is used to relieve discomfort, the more the system learns that activity equals safety. The cycle closes, but something even deeper is happening. Something that does not involve productivity alone. Something that involves the very biology of survival. Because for some nervous systems, slowing down does not merely feel unproductive, it feels dangerous. And to understand why the brain can interpret rest as a threat, we need to look at an evolutionary mechanism that continues to operate quietly inside us to this day. A mechanism that transforms stillness into vulnerability and causes some people to fear silence more than they fear the excessive effort itself. There is an experiment conducted by social psychologist Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia that produces an almost universal reaction when people first hear about it. Participants were invited to remain alone in a quiet room. No phone, no music, no books, no form of entertainment. Just sitting, thinking, for a few minutes. Before the experiment began, almost everyone stated that this would be easy. Some even said it would be pleasant. But something curious happened. When they were given the option to press a button that delivered an uncomfortable electric shock, a shock they had previously declared they would pay to avoid, a surprisingly large percentage preferred to shock themselves rather than continue sitting there doing nothing, not because they enjoyed the pain, but because the human brain, in certain states, may consider any stimulation better than no stimulation at all. When this study was published in 2014, the conclusion that captured the public's attention was simple. People seem to have difficulty being alone with their own thoughts. but there is a much deeper interpretation. Perhaps the problem is not being alone with your thoughts. Perhaps the problem is what the nervous system has learned to feel when there is nothing left to do. Because for millions of people, rest does not feel like rest. It feels like danger. It feels like falling behind. It feels like waste. It feels like guilt. You finish an important task. A free hour finally appears. Nothing urgent is happening. There is no crisis. There is no demand. There is no immediate deadline. And yet something inside you remains restless. A feeling that is difficult to explain. As if there were something you should be doing. As if resting were the wrong choice. As if stopping meant losing something important. Perhaps you recognize this pattern. You sit down to watch something you enjoy, but you cannot fully relax. You open your phone during the movie, check messages, look for something to solve, remember a future task, get up to organize something that could easily wait, sit back down, get up again, as if rest itself had become an environment too unfamiliar to inhabit for very long. Most people interpret this as a personality issue. They believe they are simply too productive, or too ambitious, or too disciplined. But modern neuroscience suggests a different possibility. Perhaps the problem is not personality. Perhaps it is the calibration of the nervous system. There is a concept in physiological psychology called safety conditioning. Throughout life, the organism learns which internal states tend to precede positive experiences and which tend to precede negative ones. This learning happens quietly, below conscious awareness, without the person ever noticing. If for years the system learned that safety depends on constant effort, it begins to associate activity with protection. Producing creates safety. Solving creates safety. Anticipating creates safety. Controlling creates safety. Doing creates safety. And when this happens for long enough, something remarkable emerges. The absence of those activities no longer feels neutral. It begins to feel risky. Not because there is real danger, but because the organism cannot find the signals it learned to associate with protection. Think about someone who grew up in an environment where mistakes carried significant consequences, where distraction was punished, where performance was valued more highly than rest, where praise arrived after results, where attention followed achievement, where emotional safety depended on getting things right. That person's nervous system begins to build a very specific association. Producing means belonging. Producing means approval. Producing means stability. Producing means protection. Decades later, even if the environment has changed completely, the organism continues operating according to the same map. Rest stops being just rest. It becomes the absence of the signals that once indicated safety. That is why so many people describe a curious feeling during vacations. During the first few days, there is anxiety, restlessness, irritability, difficulty relaxing, not because the vacation is bad, but because the system has temporarily lost the activity it was using to regulate itself. There is an extremely important concept here: functional dependence on activation. Functional dependence on activation occurs when an organism spends so much time operating in states of mobilization that it begins to interpret mobilization itself as normality. Tension becomes familiar, urgency becomes familiar, busyness becomes familiar, hyperoccupation becomes familiar, and what is familiar is often confused with what is safe by the nervous system, even when it produces suffering. This helps explain a phenomenon that many viewers of this channel probably know well. You spend weeks longing for rest, but when you finally get it, you cannot enjoy it. The body slows down, the schedule slows down, but the mind keeps running. Because what appeared to be physical exhaustion was often chronic nervous system activation, and chronic activation does not automatically disappear when work ends. It keeps operating, searching for new targets, new tasks, new problems, new demands, new reasons to remain alert. In the work of neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, there is a particularly interesting motivational system called the seeking system, the system of pursuit. It evolved to drive exploration, learning, and adaptation. It is the system that pushes us to search for resources, solve problems, explore possibilities, build the future. Under healthy conditions, it is extraordinarily useful. But when combined with prolonged states of anxiety and vigilance, it can take on a different form. The organism enters a state of constant seeking, but without a defined objective, not because there is something important to find, but because stopping the search creates discomfort. And perhaps that is exactly what many people experience without realizing it. They are not pursuing specific goals. They are pursuing relief. The next task, the next objective, the next project, the next optimization, the next improvement. All of this creates a powerful illusion, the illusion that peace exists just beyond the next achievement. But peace never arrives, because the system was never trained to rest. It was trained to seek. And when the seeking stops, discomfort appears. The most interesting part is that this discomfort does not mean something is wrong. In fact, it often means exactly the opposite. It means you have finally come into contact with a state you normally avoid. Silence, the absence of demand, empty space. And it is in that space that the nervous system reveals its true calibration. Not when it is busy, but when it is not. Because any system can function during an emergency. The more revealing question is something else. What happens when there is no emergency at all? And it is precisely here that one of the most important concepts for understanding why so many people feel guilty when they rest begins to emerge. A concept that connects productivity, identity, belonging, and survival in a way few people realize. Because for some nervous systems, doing is not simply something they do. Doing is who they believe they are. And when an entire identity has been built around usefulness, stopping can begin to feel far more frightening than continuing to run. There is a phrase many people say without realizing how much it reveals about their internal structure. I need to feel useful. At first glance, it sounds like responsibility, maturity, commitment. But in some nervous systems, that phrase does not describe a value. It describes a condition for safety. It is not I enjoy contributing, it is I can only relax when I am contributing. And that changes everything, because when usefulness becomes a condition for deserving rest, rest stops being a natural state of the organism. It becomes something that must be earned, proven, justified. There is an important line of research in developmental psychology that helps explain how this forms. Researchers such as Carol Dweck, while studying performance mindsets, observed that children exposed to conditional validation, praise linked only to results, performance, or competence, tend to develop a more fragile relationship between personal worth and achievement. The point is not that praise is bad. It is that the nervous system learns associative patterns. I am seen when I perform. I receive attention when I deliver. I am valued when I produce. Over time, these associations stop being merely conscious beliefs. They become physiological states. The organism learns that producing reduces social risk. And for a human being, social risk has never been trivial. For most of human evolution, exclusion from the group meant extreme vulnerability. So the brain treats belonging as a matter of survival. That is why social criticism, disapproval, and feelings of uselessness can activate brain regions similar to those activated by physical pain. Research by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA demonstrated exactly this. Social rejection and physical pain share partially overlapping neural circuits. Now imagine the impact of this over years. If the system has learned that social value depends on performance, it begins to operate according to a silent logic. If I stop deserving. If I am not producing, I lose value. If I rest too much, I fall behind. If I am not needed, perhaps I am not important. This logic rarely appears explicitly. It manifests as diffuse guilt, restlessness, a constant need to optimize, difficulty enjoying simple moments, a feeling that there is always something more productive that could be done. There is a concept in contemporary psychodynamic theory called performance-based identity. When this happens, a person does not simply work hard. They organize their entire sense of existence around their ability to function, to solve, to deliver, to be efficient, to anticipate, to hold everything together. And here emerges the cruelest paradox of this pattern. The more competent a person becomes, the harder it may become to stop. Because the environment continuously reinforces the behavior. They receive praise, trust, responsibilities, results. People begin to depend on them, and the nervous system interprets this as confirmation that continuing to function is essential for maintaining safety and belonging. The problem is that organisms were not designed to live in continuous mobilization. In the physiology of stress, Hans Selye described decades ago the model known as the general adaptation syndrome. The organism enters a state of alarm, then resistance, and if the stressor continues for too long without adequate recovery, it enters exhaustion. But modern exhaustion rarely looks like an immediate dramatic collapse. More often, it looks like someone who is highly functional on the outside and internally incapable of resting. The person keeps delivering, keeps working, keeps smiling, but has lost access to the deep state of restoration. It is like an engine that never fully shuts off. And engines like that eventually begin to overheat. There is a particularly interesting physiological marker in this process: heart rate variability, or HRV. HRV measures the flexibility of the autonomic nervous system, especially its ability to shift between sympathetic activation and parasympathetic recovery. Healthy nervous systems are not calm all the time. They are flexible. They activate when necessary and deactivate afterward. In people with chronic stress associated with hyperfunctioning, HRV is often reduced. The organism loses flexibility. It becomes trapped in low-level but continuous states of mobilization, and this has important cognitive consequences. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-regulation, perspective, and balanced decision-making, functions less effectively under prolonged sympathetic activation. The person begins to live in short-term mode. They put out fires, respond quickly, keep everything running, but gradually lose access to states of contemplation, deep creativity, and restorative rest. Perhaps you recognize this in yourself. You can work for hours when there is urgency, but you cannot sit in silence for 15 minutes without feeling discomfort. You can solve complex problems for other people, but you cannot simply go for a walk without turning the walk into productivity. You listen to a podcast while cooking, reply to messages while eating, plan tasks while showering, watch something while scrolling on your phone, as if every empty space needed to be immediately occupied. This is not just a digital habit. It is a difficulty inhabiting low-demand states, because low demand activates the question the system avoids: who am I when I am not doing? And that question can be profoundly destabilizing for identities built around usefulness. There is another important phenomenon here: intolerance of receptivity. Some people can give care, solve problems, support others, and produce results with remarkable ease. But they feel uncomfortable receiving help, receiving care, receiving rest, receiving free time, receiving support without first having to earn it. The system was trained to exist through action, not through receptivity. And rest is a deeply receptive state. You do not produce in it. You receive recovery, you receive pause, you receive silence. For certain nervous systems, that sounds almost dangerous, because receptivity implies vulnerability. And vulnerability, in life histories marked by excessive early responsibility, unpredictability, or the need for constant self-control, was often associated with risk. The child who had to be strong too early learns a silent lesson: if I relax, something goes wrong. Decades later, the body continues obeying that rule, even when the original danger no longer exists. The most important thing to understand here is that this is not laziness in reverse. It is not simply excessive ambition. It is neurophysiological learning. And nervous system learning can change. But it does not change through rational argument. You do not convince the body to rest by saying, everything is fine. The body needs repeated experiences showing that stopping does not produce the catastrophe it anticipates. And this is exactly where one of the most transformative concepts in this entire subject comes in: the difference between resting and feeling safe while resting. Because many people can stop the body, but the nervous system remains standing, on guard, waiting for the next demand to arrive. There is a question that is rarely asked explicitly, yet it quietly influences millions of decisions every single day. If no one were watching you, if there were no goals to achieve, if no reward were waiting on the other side, would you be able to rest without feeling guilty? For many people, the honest answer is no. And at first glance, that seems strange, because rest should feel pleasant. Pausing should bring relief. Doing nothing for a few hours should reduce tension. But for certain nervous systems, the exact opposite happens. The schedule finally opens up, work is finished, demands decrease, the body has an opportunity to recover, and paradoxically, discomfort appears. Restlessness, diffuse anxiety, the feeling that something important is being neglected. As if staying still were somehow dangerous. As if rest were wrong. As if existing without producing were a form of failure. If this sounds familiar, the problem is probably not your discipline, nor your motivation, nor your work ethic. The problem may lie in something much deeper, in the way your nervous system learned to associate personal worth, safety, and survival with a continuous state of activity. Here is something contemporary psychology has been documenting with increasing precision. The feeling of self-worth does not arise only from conscious thoughts. It emerges from physiological patterns that develop over years. The brain learns not only what to do, it learns who you need to be in order to remain safe. And in many nervous systems, especially those exposed to unpredictable, demanding, or emotionally conditional environments during critical periods of development, a quiet association begins to form. Movement means safety, productivity means value, effort means belonging, stopping means risk. This association usually does not emerge through a rational decision. It emerges through repetition, through accumulated experience, through what the organism learns by observing what happens when it produces and what happens when it does not. In the work of psychologist Carol Dweck on validation patterns and identity development, there is a particularly relevant observation. Children who receive recognition primarily for the results they produce tend to develop a different relationship with performance than children whose validation includes broader aspects of their existence. It is not simply a matter of praise. It is a matter of calibration. The nervous system begins to register which states generate connection, which states generate approval, which states reduce the risk of rejection. If recognition appears mainly when there is performance, achievement, or usefulness, an implicit association may develop. Being valued becomes synonymous with producing value. Existing is no longer enough. One must continuously justify one's presence. Decades later, this logic is still operating, even when no one is demanding anything, even when there is no objective threat, even when the environment finally offers space to rest. The system continues running the learned program: produce, move forward, do more, don't stop. Because stopping feels dangerous. There is a concept in affective neuroscience that helps explain why this happens. It is called interoceptive prediction. Researchers such as Lisa Feldman Barrett have demonstrated that the brain does not simply react to the present, it continuously predicts what it believes will happen next. Before an experience even occurs, the brain generates physiological expectations about it, and those expectations directly shape emotional states. If activity has been associated for years with safety, belonging, and validation, the brain begins predicting that staying active is necessary to maintain those conditions. When movement ceases, a conflict emerges, not because there is danger, but because the system expected activity and encountered silence, expected forward motion and encountered a pause, expected effort and encountered empty space. And any discrepancy between expectation and reality requires additional processing. The subjective consequence is familiar. Rest does not feel like rest. It feels like losing momentum. It feels like falling behind. It feels unproductive. It feels vulnerable. It is as though the organism is constantly asking, "Are you sure you can stop?" But there is something even more interesting. Very often, the guilt of rest does not appear as guilt. It appears in disguise. It shows up as restlessness, as the need to check something, as the urge to reorganize a drawer, reply to a message, plan the week, research one more piece of information, resolve one more detail, create one more goal. The system finds any available movement to avoid the psychological experience of simply doing nothing. And this brings us to a phenomenon studied by researcher Sandy Mann at the University of Central Lancashire. In a series of studies on boredom and creativity, she observed something curious. People exposed to periods of low stimulation initially experienced significant discomfort. The mind resisted. It searched for distractions. It tried to escape the absence of activity. But when they remained in that state long enough, greater levels of creativity, integration, and spontaneous idea generation began to emerge. The challenge was getting through the initial phase, the phase in which the system interpreted the lack of stimulation as something wrong, because there is a profound difference between being safe and feeling safe. Many people achieve the first state. Few achieve the second. Objectively, they are safe, but physiologically, they remain mobilized. And a mobilized organism does not interpret rest as an opportunity. It interprets rest as exposure. In evolutionary biology, there is a simple principle. Animals rest only when the system concludes that the environment is sufficiently safe. Recovery never comes first. The feeling of safety comes first. Rest is the consequence, never the cause. This means that a nervous system calibrated for continuous vigilance may have extreme difficulty accessing states of deep recovery, not because it does not want to, but because its physiology has not yet authorized that transition. That is exactly why some people can spend an entire Sunday resting and finish the day restored, while others spend that same Sunday trying to rest and finish even more exhausted. The effort is not in the resting, it is in the constant struggle against the internal impulse to keep producing, and there is a question that inevitably emerges from this pattern. If productivity creates value, if movement creates safety, if effort creates belonging, who are you when none of that is happening? Who remains when the activity disappears? Because for many nervous systems, this is not a philosophical question, it is a physiological question. A question that deeply activates the mechanisms responsible for identity, and this is precisely where understanding this phenomenon becomes even more interesting, because the problem is not merely the difficulty of resting. The problem is that, for certain nervous systems, stopping can feel like a direct threat to identity itself. But when the nervous system finally understands that rest is not abandonment, that recovery is not failure, and that personal worth does not depend on continuous productivity, something begins to change. The pause stops being interpreted as a threat. Silence no longer requires justification. And the organism discovers that there is another form of safety, not built through constant vigilance, nor through permanent effort, but through the ability to remain present without needing to prove anything. If something in this video reached you in a different way, if you recognized your own pattern in these words, share it in the comments. One word. What stayed with you? What changed after seeing the mechanism? Because sometimes transformation does not begin when we learn how to do more. It begins when we finally understand why we have never been able to stop.